Hello, everybody. Welcome to off-path attacks against public key infrastructures. My name is Elias Heftrich, and I'm a student IT security researcher for Fraunhofer Institute for Secure Information Technology, based in Darmstadt, Germany. My focus is on internet security in general and DNS caches in particular. My talk will be structured as follows. First, we'll go through the objectives. What are we going to attack and how are we going to do it? Followed by a specific attack procedure, short impact analysis, and a swift discussion of mitigation approaches. I conclude with a summary. Let's start right off with the objectives. In this presentation, I'm going to show you a specific attack on web PKI, but what is web PKI good for in the first place? So assume a client wants to exchange sensitive data with a web server, and if that connection wasn't secured, it could be eavesdropped on or modified by nation-state attackers or the common evildoers. To prevent that, there's TLS, and TLS uses certificates that bind the public key to identities. And these certificates are issued by trusted certificate authorities, and the system that manages trust behind these is the web PKI. If an attacker used a certificate which was not signed by a trusted certificate authority, maybe in a man-in-the-middle attack or impersonation attack, that attack would be noticed. Our goal today is to have such a certificate issued by a trusted certificate authority, but for a domain which we do not control, but is rather under foreign operation. The attacker model we are employing here is an off-path attacker who cannot eavesdrop on, block, delay, or modify packets in any way. He just is able to inject packets, maybe with a spoofed sender address. The attack I'm going to show you will leverage IP defragmentation cache poisoning to achieve DNS cache poisoning, and we are exploiting domain validation. Domain validation is the mechanism with which one can prove one's ownership over a domain, and it's heavily made use of in the issuance of certificates. Let's see how that works. So first, the applicant creates a certificate signing request locally and uploads it to the web server of the certificate authority. Then the DNS resolver of the certificate authority will ask the name server, which is authoritative for the applicant's domain, for the email server's name and IP address, which will answer that, of course. And now the email server sends a validation code for the domain validation to the mail server under the applicant's control. Using that validation code, the applicant can now enter it into the web server of the certificate authority, which will then offer the signed certificate for download. What we are going to do now is we're going to poison the DNS resolver's cache so that the validation code is sent to us. But to better understand that, let's first recap some concepts of DNS. When a client wants to know an IP address of a host on the internet, it will ask its DNS resolver for that. And if the resolver has already cached the answer from a previous request, it will answer with that from cache. And if not, it will do a recursive lookup of the answer. Until the name server, which is authoritative for the domain the host is located in, will answer this question, the resolver can cache the values and pass them to the client. DNS cache poisoning is simply the injection of spoofed values into the DNS resolver's cache in that process. To prevent that, there's a challenge response mechanism built into DNS, which is meant to provide security against off-path attacks and is useless against man-in-the-middle. So what we see here is a DNS message on the wire. You see the IP header, it's the blue thing, UDP header, it's the yellow thing, and the greenish thing is the DNS message itself. The mentioned challenge response scheme utilizes UDP source port randomization, as well as transaction ID randomization, and together these values give us up to 32 random bits. Guessing this is impractical for our purposes, which is why we're doing an IP fragmentation attack instead. But what's IP fragmentation in the first place? So Assume Alice wants to send Bob a message via network, and the packet containing the message is bigger than the network can handle. So the maximum transmission unit, MTU, of the network is smaller than the packet size. Now the packet needs to get split up into multiple fragments, and that can happen either in a router on the intermediate network, or if Alice had requested not to have it split up at a router, the router will generate an ICMP error message and send it to Alice, indicating that fragmentation was needed but not requested to happen. The defragmentation cache poisoning, which is our fragmentation attack, is also here, the injection of spoofed values, this time into the IP defragmentation cache of the target, of the receiver, so that the spoofed fragments, which carry our malicious payload, get reassembled with the true fragments coming from the true sender. What we are going to do, we want to have the challenge response values located on the first fragment and our malicious payload on the second fragment. We will cause the fragmentation in the first place using the aforementioned ICMP error message. We're sending this from our true IP address to the name server, which is authoritative for the target domain. We can do this because that name server does not know we're not a router in the intermediary network. And we will tell him that if he wants to send messages to the recursive resolver of the certificate authority, it has to be aware that the maximum transmission unit of an intermediary network is one of our choice. Having now fragmented the response, which is to become, which comes from the name server of the target domain, the first fragment will look something like this here. We've got the challenge response values in this fragment, along with parts of the DNS response. We will always have parts of the DNS response in there, because you see IP and UDP headers together are only, in this case, 28 bytes. And thus there will always be some part of the DNS message in there, because the IP minimum fragment size is 68. Also, notice we have to match the IP ID. IP ID basically identifies multiple fragments belonging to one packet, and the UDP checksum, which has to match. Also notice there are several counts, for example, question count, answer record count, additional record count, as well as lengths, which are encoded in this packet. And since this is the packet which will come from the name server of the target domain and the true packet, which we cannot spoof, we do not have control over these and have to respect them. The second fragment, as we want to spoof it, would look something like this. You see here the DNS payload. This is the part which we have control over, as well as IP ID, which we have to guess. In the vast majority of systems, IP ID is implemented as a counter, either incrementing on a global base or local per destination. And we can guess this by simply sending direct probes, if it's a global counter, or using side channels. But I won't go too much into detail here. Also, the UDP checksum can be guessed using the true second fragment. If you what's it called? You simply subtract one checksum from the other, and what's left over is what you add up. Maybe in the Z field, 0 flags of the eDNS record, or if we have another record which includes the time to live value, which is 32 bits in our DNS payload, we can simply add these values up there. Okay. Now that we know how to poison the resolver's cache, let's look how that would look like in a real attack. For that purpose, we've set up attacker and victim hosts under respective domains. Both are running name servers and mail servers, and the name server running under the attacker serves values that point to the attacker, but are meant to originate in the victim domain. So we're mapping victim domain names to the attacker host here. First step would be sending the ICMP fragmentation needed message to the name server of the target domain, so that fragmentation then happens. Second step is probing the IP ID, which is implemented here for our demonstration purposes as a global incrementing counter. And using that, we can now forge our spoofed second fragment and inject it into the DNS resolver's cache. Notice here, the second fragment maps the victim domain to our name server. So if there's a question for the name server which is authoritative for the victim domain, it would be answered with the name server we set up under the attacker. Let's see how that looked in a recorded demo. So we've got on the lower left, there's just a traffic dump for later, and on the upper left, it's where the magic happens now. The implementation runs in an infinite loop, which is because we cannot know when exactly the DNS resolver and the certificate authority will send the DNS message, the request to the name server. And notice here we're spoofing 64 forged second fragments, which is basically the shotgun approach to guessing the right IP ID. Okay, now that we've poisoned the IP defragmentation cache of the DNS resolver, we can go on poisoning the DNS cache. We trigger that by simply issuing the certificate signing request to the web server of the certificate authority, which will then have its DNS resolver ask the true name server of the victim domain for the records of the mail server. The name server of the victim domain will answer, fragmented because we have requested to, and this name server exposes the default behavior, which we see in many name servers, which is it answers the question for the IP address, but along with that, it gives updated values for the name server of the domain, which is what we are also exploiting here. So triggering the DNS request works like this. We're entering here our certificate signing request and uploading it using the button. Now we're choosing an email address under the victim domain, and the request is sent. Okay, now that we've poisoned the DNS resolver's cache, we can go on exploiting domain validation, which we do another time by issuing another certificate signing request to the web server of the certificate authority. Now the DNS resolver will ask our name server, which we've set up, for the email address, for the IP address of the mail server of the victim domain, because we injected and poisoned the DNS resolver's cache. We can answer that question with an IP address which is running under a host we control. That looks something like this here. Here we choose another email address running under the victim domain, and the requests are going out. And now pay attention to the lower left pane, where we see the traffic coming in. There it is, DNS traffic. All right, looks good. Okay, now the email server will send us the validation code, and we can echo the validation code to the web server of the certificate authority, which will then offer us the certificate for download. Let's see if that worked. Okay, guess who's got friends? What did they write us? Okay, here we see that email was sent to the victim domain, but it went to our host, the attacker host, and that's the validation code. Okay, we could now go on. Oops. We could now go on and enter that in the form at the web server, which we do not know. We do not do here because we're not evil, but we could. And then we were able to download the certificate. Using this certificate, we could then go on and impersonate a service running under the victim domain, plausibly, meaning the attack would not be noticed if there were, even if there's TLS in use, because our certificate is signed by a trusted certificate authority. Let's go on and see what that means for the victims. So for victim users, the implications are derived from any successful attack on a TLS session. We could, where we have a man in the middle, for example, we could inject malware or steal credentials, sensitive data, identity, you name it. And if such an attack gets public, that usually means a lot of loss of reputation and trust for the victim certificate authority, as well as for the target domain. But how real are these attacks? Well, we tested 17 certificate authorities that perform domain validation, and together cover more than 95% of the certificate market. 5 of them are vulnerable, but already one vulnerable certificate authority is sufficient to obtain the target certificate, which means where PKI security is undermined. All right, doesn't sound good. How could we prevent this, or at least make it harder? Let's first have a look at the preconditions of the attack for this. We exploited domain validation, so this needs to be offered in the first place. We did an IP fragmentation attack, so IP fragmentation needs to be allowed, both in the victim name server of the target domain, as well as in the certificate authorities network. And also, we targeted DNS via UDP. So then, could we just disable domain validation if it's attackable? Well, we could, but it would leave us only with much more expensive alternatives, not the way to go. What about suppressing IP fragmentation? Also we could, and some certificate authorities actually do this, but this would disconnect some networks, so on the last resort defense mechanism here, definitely. What about forcing DNS over TCP rather than using UDP? Also we could, but off-path TCP injection attacks do exist. At the moment primarily on HTTP traffic, for example, making assumptions about the upper layers, but it's probable that such attacks will be developed in the future too. Also, notice that we've seen an increase in short-lived BGP prefix hijacking attacks with the purpose of doing a man-in-the-middle on DNS cache poisoned, man-in-the-middle for DNS cache poisoning. And the challenge response values, which we have seen before, do not offer security against man-in-the-middle, because the man-in-the-middle could just see the values and echo them, no problem here. Things like these happened, for example, I think it was in May, when users of the cryptocurrency service, MyEtherWallet, fell prey to an impersonation attack. Yes, in this attack there was not a spoofed certificate used, at least not a validly spoofed certificate. So had the attackers used our approach to getting certificate authority signed certificates, this attack would have been much more devastating. Looks like we need man-in-the-middle resilient domain validation, at least in a long perspective. How could we do this? One approach would be doing DNS over HTTPS or TLS, but that would mean we're securing a public key infrastructure with the very same public key infrastructure. So we're assuming security concludes security, nothing won here. Another approach is DNSSEC, which is certainly the way to go. So where DNS records get signed by the owner, and we're using basically public key infrastructure built into DNS. But given that it was drafted in the mid-90s and it's still not properly deployed, we cannot rely on that one. Which is why we at Fraunhofer have come up with a drop-in replacement we call Domain Validation ++ or DV++. DV++ uses multiple vantage points or DV agent, which are distributed over the internet and communicate with an orchestrator in the certificate authority. The DV agents all do the DNS part of domain validation and communicate via HTTPS with the orchestrator, who does the voting of that DNS responses. And communication is done via HTTPS using out of PKI certificates, picture, directory trusted certificates, because if we use certificates which are part of the web PKI, that would again be relying on a PKI for securing the very same public key infrastructure. Communication happens over mostly non-overlapping paths through the internet, and that aims at securing the certificate authority side even for strong man-in-the-middle nation-state attackers. Okay, time to draw the conclusions. The summary. We've seen an off-path attack against domain validation, which leveraged IP defragmentation cache poisoning to achieve DNS cache poisoning. And using that, we were able to acquire fraudulent certificates for domains which are under foreign operation. This means ultimately web PKI, which is meant to provide security even against strong man-in-the-middle attackers, relies on a weak building block that can be circumvented by a weak off-path attacker. Thank you for your attention. All right, questions?
Do you have any evidence of this happening by real attack?
We just disclosed this type of attack, I think in October it was, and we did not collect any evidence on that yet. So it's very recently disclosed, no data available yet.
You mentioned that out of the 17 CAs you tried, it worked on 5 of them. What are the reasons what are the other reasons that it didn't work on the rest of them, and are those potential mitigation mechanisms?
Okay. Yes, I mentioned, for example, that not every CA supports fragmentation, and against that very specific attack we did, the IP fragmentation attack, that helps, obviously. Also, it's quite difficult to forge the second fragment, given that you don't always have control, or you don't have the most degree of control over the second fragment, given that the counts and lengths are encoded in the first fragment. So I wouldn't call that a reliable mitigation mechanism, but yes. Okay.
So in DV++, as you described it, there's multiple vantage points. Oh, this is right here. There's multiple vantage points in which you do the DNS query. Is there any advantage to having those vantage points be unpredictable or different every time, or is it fine to have these multiple vantage points be statically configured?
Okay. I didn't think about this yet, actually. Good question. I don't think there would be too much use, but maybe as an add-on from increased security, if you really need that, maybe I can research that if you want to. Just leave me your email address and I can send you the answer.
Okay, thank you.
No questions? All right, then thank you for your attention.